On January 28, 2026, after spending nearly 27 years on death row, Charles Victor Thompson is scheduled to be executed by lethal injection at the Huntsville Unit in Texas. He will be 55 years old. In this video, we will talk about what happened, the brutal double murder that put him there, the audacious jail escape that made national headlines, and the chilling jailhouse confession where he tried to blame the hospital for killing his victim. But to uncover the events of that fateful night and why Charles ended up on death row, we have to go back to a spring evening in April 1998 and a jealous rage that would end 2 lives. April 29, 1998, a warm Wednesday night in North Harris County, Texas. Charles Victor Thompson, a 27-year-old from the affluent Houston suburb of Tomball, was drunk. He had been drinking heavily all day, mixing alcohol with cocaine, a combination that had become his daily ritual. His life was falling apart, and he knew it. His on-again, off-again girlfriend, Dennise Hayslip, had finally had enough of him. She had found someone new, a bartender named Darren Cain, and Charles Thompson could not accept that. He would not accept that. That night, Thompson drove to Dennis's apartment on Wunderlich Drive in the Waterman Crossing development. He knew Darren Cain would be there. He knew they were together, and he was going to confront them both. What happened next would destroy multiple families and launch one of the most infamous jail escapes in Texas history. Glenda Dennise Hayslip was 39 years old and trying to start over. She had a teenage son named Wade from a previous relationship, and she was looking for stability, for happiness, for something better than what she had with Charles Thompson. Dennise worked at a moving company in Tomball, where she met Thompson in June of 1997. He was charming at first, good-looking, the kind of guy who could talk his way into or out of anything. Thompson moved into the home Dennise shared with her son, her co-worker Lisa Gonzalez, and Gonzalez's 2 daughters. But the charm didn't last. It never does with men like Charles Thompson. While living there, Thompson grew increasingly jealous, possessive, and angry. During fits of rage, he would throw things, kick the refrigerator, punch and kick the walls, leaving holes throughout the house. Thompson rarely worked, relying on Dennise and her roommate to pay the bills. When Gonzalez asked him to contribute financially, Thompson became irate. On one occasion, Gonzalez heard Thompson screaming at Dennise and calling her names. She watched him shaking her violently. When Gonzalez tried to intervene, Thompson grabbed her and threw her to the ground. She tried to call the police, but the phone went dead. Thompson had ripped the cord out of the wall. The abuse continued for months. In March 1998, just weeks before the murder, Dennise's friend accompanied her and Thompson to a local bar. Thompson became sullen and angry during the evening. He told Dennise he wanted her to sit with him and not dance with anyone else. When the friend saw Dennise 3 days later, one side of her face was bruised, her lip was split, and there were bruises on her neck. Dennise never reported the abuse. She never pressed charges. Like so many victims of domestic violence, she stayed. She hoped he would change. She believed the apologies, but eventually even Dennise had to admit the truth. Charles Thompson was never going to change. He was never going to stop drinking. He was never going to stop using cocaine. He was never going to stop hurting her. So she made a decision. She ended the relationship and started seeing someone else, a 30-year-old bartender named Darren Cain. Darren Cain was everything Charles Thompson was not. He was employed. He was stable. He was kind. Darren worked as a bartender at a local bar where Dennise was a regular customer. They became friends first, then something more. People who knew Darren described him as friendly, patient, and caring. He was the complete opposite of the volatile, jealous, violent man Dennise had been with. Darren was from Spring, Texas, just outside Houston. He was 30 years old, full of life, with friends who loved him and a future ahead of him. He had no idea that his relationship with Dennise Hayslip would cost him his life. He had no idea that a jealous ex-boyfriend was about to destroy everything. The night of April 29, 1998, Thompson and Dennise went to their usual bar. They had been drinking together, even though their relationship was over. Around 2:01 in the morning on April 30th, Darren Cain received a phone call. Thompson had been threatening him over the phone. Darren called his best friend Tony Alfano and told him that Thompson was beating up or messing with Dennise. Darren was going over to her apartment to help her. It was a decision that would cost him his life. When Darren arrived at Dennis's apartment, Thompson was already there. The two men got into a physical altercation. Darren Cain was bigger, stronger, and sober. He beat Thompson badly, giving him a black eye and leaving his face swollen. A neighbor named Catherine Page woke up around 3:00 a.m. to the sound of screaming. She heard a female voice saying, "Stop and help." She called the police. When Harris County Deputy William Coker arrived at the scene, he found Thompson, Dennise, and Darren standing outside the apartment. Everyone appeared calm. Thompson's face was swollen from the fight, but Coker determined that Thompson had started it. Dennise was agitated, apologizing to Darren for all of this. Thompson walked out of the apartment yelling, cursing, and calling Dennise a whore. Darren told Thompson to chill. Thompson looked at him and said, "Do you want to die, motherfucker?" Deputy Coker told Thompson to leave the property. He warned him that if he returned, he would be committing criminal trespass. Thompson drove away into the night, but he was not done. He was humiliated, beaten, embarrassed in front of the woman he considered his property. And he was going to make them pay. Both of them. Around 6:00 OM on April 30th, 1998, Thompson returned to Dennise Hayslip's apartment. He had been gone for approximately 3 hours, but this time he came prepared. This time he had a gun, a .380 caliber handgun that would become the murder weapon. The neighbor's son heard gunshots as he was leaving for school that morning. Thompson had kicked in the front door of Dennis's apartment. The door frame was smashed, evidence of his violent entry. What happened inside that apartment would haunt the survivors for decades. Forensic evidence and witness statements established that Thompson fired 4 rounds into Darren Cain's neck and chest, resulting in immediate fatal trauma. Darren Cain, the 30-year-old bartender who had only come to help Dennise, was dead within seconds. But Thompson was not finished. After killing Darren, Thompson turned his attention to Dennise. He reloaded the weapon, looked at the woman he claimed to love, and said, "I can shoot you too, bitch." Then he pressed the gun barrel against her cheek and pulled the trigger. The bullet entered through her cheek, causing catastrophic internal damage. It destroyed her dentures and nearly severed her tongue completely. The wound was devastating. Blood poured from her mouth and face, but Dennise Hayslip was still alive. She was conscious. She was aware of what had happened. And she knew who had done it. Thompson fled the scene and disposed of the murder weapon in Cypress Creek. He then drove to the home of a friend named Diane Zernia. When he arrived, Zernia was getting her daughter ready for school. Thompson waited in the living room and fell asleep on the couch. After her daughter left, Zernia turned on the television and watched the morning news. There was a story about a shooting in North Harris County. 2 people shot, 1 dead, 1 critically injured. When Thompson woke up a couple of hours later, Zernia noticed his black eye. She joked, "I hope the other guy looks worse." Thompson looked at her and said, "He does. He is dead." Thompson had just confessed to murder. He told Zernia the details of what he had done. He described shooting Darren Cain. He described shooting Dennise in the face. Zernia was the only witness who could link Thompson directly to the homicides, and Thompson knew it. He would later try to have her killed. Deputy Coker returned to Dennis's apartment that morning after receiving reports of gunshots. What he found was a crime scene of horrific violence. He found Dennise Hayslip sitting in a pool of blood with a bullet hole in her right cheek and a great amount of blood draining from her mouth. Despite her catastrophic injuries, Dennise was conscious. Coker asked her if Thompson had shot her. She nodded. Darren Cain's body was inside the apartment. He had been shot 4 times and was clearly dead. Dennise was transported by life flight helicopter to Herman Hospital. Her injuries were severe, but the nurse on the helicopter indicated to Dennise's family that she would likely recover. Dennise's tongue had been nearly severed. Her dentures, which she needed due to a genetic gum disease, had been blown out by the bullet. She could not speak. But when her brother arrived and asked, "Did Chuck do this?" Dennise nodded emphatically. She passed him a note that said, "Chuck did this." The medical team at Herman Hospital faced an impossible challenge. They needed to secure an airway for Dennise, but the swelling of her tongue and the internal damage caused by the bullet made it extremely difficult. During the procedure, her breathing tube was dislodged from her windpipe. Medical records showed that Dennise went without oxygen for 5 to 10 minutes. She fell into a coma due to bradycardia. 6 days later, on May 6, 1998, Dennise's family made the agonizing decision to remove her from life support. Dennise Hayslip was 39 years old. She left behind a teenage son named Wade, who would grow up without his mother. Wade Hayslip was just 15 years old when he learned his mother had been murdered. Thompson contacted his father after confessing to Diane Zernia, and his father facilitated his surrender to authorities later that morning. Thompson was arrested and charged with capital murder. But even behind bars, Thompson was not finished causing destruction. While awaiting trial in the Harris County Jail, Thompson approached fellow inmates Jack Reed and Max Humphrey with a plan. He wanted to hire a hitman to murder Diane Zernia. She was the only witness who could link him to the homicides. He correctly identified her as the person who could send him to death row. Law enforcement was tipped off by one of the inmates. They orchestrated an undercover operation where investigator Gary Johnson posed as a hitman. Johnson met with Thompson in a visiting booth and wore a wire to record their conversation. During this meeting, Thompson offered Johnson $1,500 to retrieve the murder weapon from Cypress Creek and to murder Diane Zernia. Thompson pressed a hand-drawn map against the glass of the visitor's booth, showing Zernia's address and the location where he had disposed of the gun. He provided detailed descriptions of Zernia's family and vehicles. He wanted her dead, and he wanted proof that the job was done. But Thompson was not satisfied with one murder-for-hire plot. He approached another inmate named Robin Rhodes with a second plan. Rhodes would later testify that Thompson gave him a hit list of potential state witnesses. The list included Zernia and other people who could testify against him. Thompson's instructions were clear: either kill them or persuade them not to be there. Rhodes was a full-time informant for Harris County law enforcement. He had worked as a confidential informant in over 50 cases. He reported everything to the authorities. Thompson had no idea he was talking to someone who was recording every word. The trial of Charles Victor Thompson began in Harris County in early 1999. He was charged with capital murder for the deaths of Dennise Hayslip and Darren Cain. The prosecution, led by Kelly Siegler and Vic Wesner, had overwhelming evidence. The testimony of Diane Zernia, who had heard Thompson confess to the murders. The forensic evidence linking the .380 caliber murder weapon to Thompson. The testimony of multiple witnesses who had seen Thompson's violent behavior toward Dennise. The undercover recordings of Thompson trying to hire a hitman to kill witnesses. And perhaps most damning, testimony about Thompson's character. Prosecutors showed jurors letters Thompson had written while in jail. The letters were filled with racial slurs. Thompson expressed a desire to join the white supremacist group Aryan Brotherhood. He signed letters to his brother as the Chuckster Killer. A psychologist who evaluated Thompson characterized him as a narcissistic sociopath. The prosecutor called him a pretty boy who flew into rages when he did not get his way. The defense team, led by attorney Terry Geiser, faced a nearly impossible task. The evidence was overwhelming. But they focused on one key argument. They argued that Dennise Hayslip's death was not directly caused by Thompson's gunshot. They claimed that medical negligence during her hospitalization was the actual cause of death. The defense called an expert witness named Dr. Paul Radelat, who testified that the medical team failed to correctly place a nasotracheal tube and then failed to monitor her breathing. He argued that Dennise fell into a coma because of hospital errors, not because of the gunshot wound. Thompson's attorneys argued that the decision by Dennise's family to remove her from life support constituted an intervening cause that absolved Thompson of criminal responsibility. If Dennise had survived, Thompson's maximum sentence would have been life in prison. But the prosecution destroyed this argument on cross-examination. Dr. Radelat was forced to concede that Dennise probably would have died without any medical intervention. The gunshot wound to her face had nearly severed her tongue. The tongue's high vascularity meant she was at imminent risk of bleeding to death or drowning in her own blood. Wade Hayslip, Dennise's son, would later put it simply, "She is not in the hospital if you do not shoot her." Ultimately, the truth is that you held a gun to somebody's face because you pulled the trigger. On April 14, 1999, the jury found Charles Victor Thompson guilty of capital murder. He was sentenced to death. Thompson showed no visible reaction when the sentence was read. The families of Dennise Hayslip and Darren Cain quietly wept and embraced. Justice had been served. Or so they thought. Thompson was transported to death row to await execution. But his story was far from over. His first death sentence would be overturned. He would be resentenced, and then he would do something no one expected. He would escape. In October 2001, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals reversed Thompson's death sentence. The court found that prosecutors had violated his Sixth Amendment right to counsel. They had sent an undercover investigator to meet with Thompson in jail to obtain information about the murder-for-hire plot. This violated his constitutional rights. However, the appeals court upheld his capital murder conviction. Thompson would face a new punishment trial. A new jury would decide whether he should be sentenced to death or life in prison. The resentencing trial took place in October 2005. This time, prosecutors relied on testimony from Robin Rhodes, the jailhouse informant who had heard Thompson discuss his hit list of witnesses. The defense challenged Rhodes's credibility, pointing out that he was a full-time informant who had participated in over 50 cases. But the jury believed him. On October 28, 2005, a new jury again sentenced Charles Victor Thompson to death. Thompson was being held in the Harris County Jail awaiting transfer back to death row at the Huntsville Unit in Livingston. He was in the high-security J-Pod unit at the Baker Street facility. He had been sentenced to die twice. He had murdered 2 people. He had tried to hire hitmen to kill witnesses. By all accounts, his story should have ended there. But Charles Victor Thompson had other plans. What happened next would shock the nation and expose catastrophic failures in the Harris County jail system. On November 3, 2005, just 6 days after being sentenced to death for the second time, Charles Thompson walked out of the Harris County Jail. He simply walked out, through the front door, past multiple guards, into the streets of downtown Houston, and he disappeared. The escape was meticulously planned and brazenly executed. Thompson had smuggled several items into his cell using a legal binder, which inmates are permitted to keep. These items included a handcuff key, a fake identification badge, and a set of civilian clothes. Khaki pants, a dark blue shirt, white tennis shoes. These were the same clothes Thompson had worn during his sentencing hearing. He had somehow smuggled them back to his cell after being convicted. Thompson later claimed that a sergeant had found a previous set of smuggled clothes but had merely confiscated them as contraband without reporting the incident to the district attorney's office. The negligence was staggering. A man sentenced to death for double murder was able to hide civilian clothes, a handcuff key, and a fake ID badge in his jail cell. And no one noticed. No one cared. No one stopped him. On the afternoon of November 3rd, Thompson was taken to a visitor's room for what he claimed was a meeting with his attorney. The visitor was not Thompson's attorney of record, Terry Geiser. Investigators later determined the visitor was another attorney, but his name was never publicly released. He was considered a witness, not an accomplice. After the attorney left, Thompson was alone in the room. He slipped out of his handcuffs using the smuggled key. He changed out of his bright orange prison jumpsuit and into the civilian clothes. Khakis, blue shirt, tennis shoes. He looked like any other professional visiting the jail. Then he pulled out his fake identification badge. It was actually an inmate ID card issued by the Texas Department of Criminal Justice. Thompson had put a piece of tape over the part of the card that identified him as an inmate. The badge now claimed he was a state investigator with the Texas Attorney General's office. Thompson walked out of the prisoner's booth in the visiting room and headed toward the exit. He flashed his fake ID badge at jail employees as he passed their workstations. At least 4 guards saw him. At least 4 people looked at his badge and waved him through. No one questioned him. No one asked for proper identification. No one noticed that the man walking through their facility was a convicted double murderer who had just been sentenced to death. Thompson was led into the jail's visitor lobby. From there, he walked through the front door and into the streets of downtown Houston. He was free. A death row inmate had just walked out of one of the largest county jails in America, and no one had stopped him. The escape triggered a massive manhunt. The United States Marshal Service designated Thompson a federal fugitive and offered a $10,000 reward for his capture. Airports were alerted. Border Patrol was notified. Law enforcement agencies across the country were searching for a man who had murdered 2 people and tried to have witnesses assassinated. The families of his victims were terrified. Dennise Hayslip's mother, Winona Dennise, thought people were joking when she received calls about the escape. She said, "I thought it was the sickest joke anyone had ever played on me." When she realized it was true, she was devastated. "My heart died," she said. Prosecutors had previously accused Thompson of trying to hire hitmen to kill witnesses and members of Dennis's family. The Dennise family went into hiding, staying in hotels and with friends in other parts of the state. They feared for their lives. Thompson's journey as a fugitive reads like something out of a movie. He made his way to a railroad yard and boarded a freight train heading east. He stayed in an open boxcar as the train rolled through East Texas. He later described the experience as an adventure. He said he felt dirty and happy. Thompson rode the rails like a hobo from another era, a convicted killer hiding among the freight cars, watching the Texas landscape roll by, free for the first time in years. Eventually, Thompson reached Shreveport, Louisiana, approximately 200 miles from Houston. He stole a bicycle to get around. He needed money, so he came up with a plan. Hurricane Katrina had devastated the Gulf Coast just months earlier. Thousands of evacuees were still displaced. Thompson began posing as a Katrina evacuee, approaching strangers and asking for help. Good Samaritans gave him money, food, and supplies. They had no idea they were helping a fugitive murderer. Thompson's escape ended on November 6, 2005, 3 days after he walked out of the Harris County Jail. Police received a tip that Thompson was in Shreveport. They found him standing outside a liquor store called Daiquiri Unlimited, drunk and talking on a payphone. He was trying to call friends overseas to arrange a wire transfer for a planned trip to Canada. He wanted to flee the country entirely. When police approached him, Thompson was too intoxicated to resist. An officer asked his name. Thompson looked at them and said, "You know who I am." Asked again, he identified himself as Charles Thompson. Witnesses said Thompson was laughing during his arrest. He did not appear afraid or upset. One employee at the liquor store said he seemed to be treating the whole thing as a big joke. He was arrested by Shreveport police and United States Marshals. The nationwide manhunt was over. The investigation into Thompson's escape revealed catastrophic failures by jail personnel. Lieutenant John Martin of the Harris County Sheriff's Department was blunt. There is no scenario under which it is even conceivable that someone who is on death row could simply walk out of a jail, he said. Thompson did not use force. He did not use a weapon. He simply talked his way out. The escape resulted from multiple errors by jail personnel. Approximately 4,000 prisoners were held at the Baker Street facility. Thompson's escape was the first since the facility had been built about 3 years earlier. Investigators found Thompson's orange jumpsuit in a room on the second floor used by attorneys to meet with clients. His civilian clothes were later discovered hidden behind another jail facility downtown. This suggested Thompson had help. Someone had stashed those clothes for him. John Dennise, Dennis Hayslip's brother, did not believe Thompson planned the escape alone. "There is no way Chuck had the brainpower for this," he said. "He is not the sharpest pencil in the box." The family was relieved when they learned of Thompson's capture, but furious at the jail for allowing him to escape in the first place. "What happened should never have been possible," Dennise said. They dropped the ball. Prosecutors agreed. Kelly Siegler, who had worked on Thompson's original case, called him one of the most dangerous people she had ever prosecuted. "People expect the typical capital murder defendant is not going to look anything like him," she said. "He is the average, all-American, some would say nice-looking man. You would never say he is so sick." Siegler revealed that Thompson had sent her a threatening letter from death row in 2001. Even after being convicted of murder, he was still trying to intimidate people. Defense attorney Brad Lawler summed up the situation perfectly. He described Thompson as sociable, affable, and articulate, but he never learned to function as a well-adjusted adult, Lawler said. Thompson had squandered every opportunity he had been given: nice parents, upper-middle-class home, good education, and yet he had become a murderer, a con artist, and a fugitive. Thompson's escape exposed systemic failures in the Harris County jail system. Heads rolled, policies were reviewed, security measures were increased. But for the families of Dennis Hayslip and Darren Cain, the damage was done. They had spent 3 terrifying days not knowing if the man who had murdered their loved ones would come for them next. Thompson was returned to Texas and placed on death row at the Huntsville Unit in Livingston. This time, there would be no escape. He would spend the next 2 decades in a 6 by 9 foot cell, 23 hours a day, waiting for the state to execute him. The appeals process for Charles Victor Thompson lasted nearly 2 more decades. His legal team raised numerous issues with his conviction and sentences. They filed claim after claim, arguing constitutional violations, ineffective assistance of counsel, and prosecutorial misconduct. In November 2011, Thompson filed a habeas application claiming intellectual disability, which would make him ineligible for execution under the Supreme Court's decision in Atkins v. Virginia. His attorneys presented evidence of IQ scores in the 70s, adaptive deficits, and childhood trauma. But the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals dismissed the application. Prosecutors presented evidence from pretrial and trial phase testing indicating Thompson had an IQ of 110, placing him in the average to above average range. This was inconsistent with intellectual disability. Furthermore, Thompson's ability to plan the murders, orchestrate the murder-for-hire plots, and execute the elaborate jail escape all demonstrated significant cognitive ability. The appeals dragged on year after year. October 31, 2007. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals affirmed Thompson's second death sentence. October 6, 2008. The United States Supreme Court denied certiorari. April 17, 2013. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals denied Thompson's first state habeas corpus application. March 9, 2016. His second habeas appeal was denied. March 23, 2017. The United States District Court for the Southern District of Texas denied his federal habeas petition, February 18, 2019. The Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals granted Thompson's request for a certificate of appealability on a specific claim and heard his appeal. October 29, 2019, the Fifth Circuit affirmed the District Court's decision. May 7, 2020, the Fifth Circuit denied a request for rehearing. March 22, 2021, the United States Supreme Court denied certiorari on the federal habeas appeal. Thompson had exhausted his appeals. On September 11, 2025, Harris County prosecutors obtained a death warrant for Charles Victor Thompson. The execution was scheduled for January 28, 2026, by lethal injection at the Huntsville Unit. This would be the first execution under newly elected District Attorney Sean Thierry's leadership. Friends and family of Darren Cain sat in the courtroom gallery as prosecutor Andrew Smith detailed Thompson's exhausted appeals. "This has been a long, long journey for the families of the victims," Smith said. "It should be noted that the Cain family and friends of Darren are present in the courtroom. They have been looking forward to this day very much." Thompson watched the proceedings via video conference from the Polunsky Unit. He sat at a table wearing a sleeveless white jumpsuit. He did not appear to react or say anything throughout the hearing. His attorney, Eric Allen, an Ohio criminal defense lawyer representing Thompson pro bono, said he only became aware that an execution date would be sought when members of the district attorney's office searched Thompson's cell. As of late 2025, Thompson remains on death row at the Polunsky Unit. He has spent nearly half his life in prison. He is now 55 years old. His aging parents no longer make the trip to Livingston for visits. Thompson spends his time reading, writing to pen pals, and fundraising through a network of supporters. Most of his supporters are women. Approximately 300 people are members of a Facebook group called Friends of Charles Victor Thompson, operated by a woman in Wales. Thompson has given interviews to the media over the years, including an episode of the Netflix documentary series I Am a Killer in 2018. In that interview, Thompson maintained his position that he did not directly cause Dennise Hayslip's death. He blamed the hospital. He blamed medical negligence. He blamed everyone but himself. But even the defense's own expert witness had admitted under oath that Dennise probably would have died without medical intervention. In an interview with the Houston Press in October 2025, Thompson expressed remorse. "There were no winners in this situation," he said. "It is tragic what happened. I regret it. I have remorse. I want people to be able to heal and move past it. I pray for them, and I have asked them to forgive me. But is that remorse genuine, or is it simply the words of a man who knows he is about to die?" Thompson claimed he was still immature at age 27. He said he was an alcoholic. He was strung out on cocaine. He had anger issues. He was wild. He was out of control. But none of that excuses what he did. None of that brings back Dennise Hayslip or Darren Cain. None of that heals the wounds of the families who lost their loved ones. Wade Hayslip is now in his early 40s. He was just 15 years old when his mother was murdered. He has spent his entire adult life without her. In interviews, Wade has been clear about his feelings. "She is not in the hospital if you do not shoot her," he said. "I feel like this is like a 5-year-old when you know you caught them doing something wrong, and they continue to maintain they did not do it, even though you literally saw them do it." Wade has had nightmares about Thompson for years, recurring dreams where Thompson shoots him. The trauma of that night in April 1998 has followed him his entire life. Thompson reportedly sent a letter of apology to Jamie Butler Cole, though the contents of that letter have never been made public. Whether the victims' families have found any peace from Thompson's expressions of remorse is something only they know. The case of Charles Victor Thompson raises difficult questions that have no easy answers. Should a man be executed for a crime committed while under the influence of drugs and alcohol? Does substance abuse excuse murder? Does it mitigate responsibility? Thompson claims he was not in his right mind that night in April 1998. But he was lucid enough to arm himself with a gun. He was lucid enough to drive to Dennis's apartment. He was lucid enough to kick in the door. He was lucid enough to shoot Darren Cain 4 times. He was lucid enough to reload his weapon, look at Dennise, and say, "I can shoot you too, bitch." He was lucid enough to shoot her in the face. He was lucid enough to flee the scene and dispose of the murder weapon. He was lucid enough to confess to Diane Zernia. He was lucid enough to plan multiple murder-for-hire plots from jail. And he was lucid enough to plan and execute an elaborate escape from a maximum security jail facility. The execution chamber at the Huntsville Unit will be prepared on January 28, 2026. Witnesses will gather. Among them will likely be members of the Hayslip, Dennise, and Cain families. People who have waited nearly 28 years for this moment. Thompson will be strapped to a gurney. He will be given the opportunity to make a final statement. He may apologize, he may maintain his innocence, he may remain silent, or he may say something that shocks the world one last time. Then a 3-drug protocol will be administered. First, a sedative to render him unconscious, then a paralytic to stop his breathing. Finally, a drug to stop his heart. If everything goes as planned, Charles Victor Thompson will be pronounced dead within minutes. The families of Dennise Hayslip and Darren Cain have waited nearly 3 decades for closure. Teresa Cain has waited to see justice for her son Darren, the 30-year-old bartender who was murdered simply for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. The Dennise family has waited to see justice for Dennise, the 39-year-old mother who was killed by a man who claimed to love her. And Wade Hayslip has waited his entire adult life to see the man who killed his mother face the ultimate punishment. The execution of Charles Victor Thompson will not bring back Dennise Hayslip. It will not bring back Darren Cain. It will not erase the decades of pain and trauma experienced by their families. But for the state of Texas, it will represent the final chapter in one of the most infamous criminal cases in Harris County history. A case that began with a jealous rage. A case that included 2 brutal murders, multiple murder-for-hire plots, and an audacious escape that made national headlines. A case that has taken 28 years to reach its conclusion. What is not in dispute is the horror of what Charles Victor Thompson did on April 30, 1998. Darren Cain was 30 years old. He was shot 4 times while trying to protect a woman from her abusive ex-boyfriend. He died on the floor of an apartment in North Harris County. Dennise Hayslip was 39 years old. She was shot in the face by a man who said he loved her. She spent 6 days in a coma before her family made the agonizing decision to remove her from life support. She left behind a teenage son who would grow up without a mother. 2 people are dead because Charles Victor Thompson could not accept that a woman had the right to leave him. 2 people are dead because of jealousy. 2 people are dead because of rage. 2 people are dead because of a man who saw women as property and rivals as obstacles to be eliminated. The case of Charles Victor Thompson is now approaching its final chapter. A brutal double murder driven by jealousy and possessiveness. A defendant who tried to blame the hospital for killing his victim. Multiple plots to murder witnesses. An audacious escape that exposed catastrophic failures in the Harris County jail system. Nearly 3 decades on death row. And finally, on a winter day in January 2026, an execution. Justice, such as it is, will be served. The families will gather. The witnesses will watch. The drugs will be administered. And Charles Victor Thompson, the man who murdered 2 people and then tried to have witnesses killed, the man who escaped from death row and posed as a Hurricane Katrina evacuee, The man who has spent 27 years waiting for this moment will finally face the ultimate punishment for his crimes. Whether that execution brings true justice or simply ends the life of a broken man who could never control his demons is a question that will remain long after the needle enters his vein.